exploring the culture, the adventure, and the impact of martial arts. That's what we do at Kung Fu Podcast, and I'm your host, T.W. Smith. Thank you very much for joining me today, and if this is your first time here to Kung Fu Podcast, welcome. You're in the audience of some of the finest and sharpest martial artists in the world. The types of folks that practice their craft consistently and with their objectives in mind. And today's podcast, in some shape, form, or fashion, is probably going to give you some things to consider through your martial arts training. Before we get into it, thank you to the folks who have reached out to let me know how much they appreciate the work. And I'd like to specifically say thank you to a young man named Braxton, who was given a school project, and of all the topics in the world that he could choose, he chose martial arts. As part of that project, he had to select a mentor, a coach, somebody that might guide him through his pursuit in his passion. And he chose Kung Fu Podcast for that role. There's a lot of things about Kung Fu Podcast that I'm very proud of. Some of the relationships that I've made over the years, but I want you to know that I was extremely proud, Braxton, when you chose Kung Fu Podcast to be a part of your project. I'd like to also make you aware of a project that is titled Exiles and Heroes and is put out by Mr. Alex Gillis. If that name sounds familiar to you, we featured his work on Taekwondo, a killing art, in episodes 100 and 101. If you go to Facebook and type in Exiles and Heroes, it'll take you right there to their page, and it's got some really interesting animations and graphics that tell the story of the development of Taekwondo. So when you get a moment, check that out. Exiles and Heroes. Type it in, and I know there's a Facebook page. I believe there's also a website page as well, but go ahead and look that up. With all of that done, let's get ready to move into the main part of the program, which is a featured article by Mr. Peter Consterdine. Hopefully for many of you all, that name sounds familiar. He lives out in the UK. He's a 9th dan in karate, and he started his karate journey in 1964. He is an influential instructor for Ian Abernathy. He worked as a doorman in Manchester for over 10 years during the 1970s and 80s, and that is where he began honing his thinking about personal combat and his combative approach to the martial arts. Peter also has many years of experience in the security industry and runs his own security risk management company. We've also featured one of his other works here, Man or System, in episode number 76, where we were also highlighting a review on the rear naked choke. You can find that particular podcast at kungfupodcast.com/76. By the time we go through this essay, and I'm going to bring in some other resources, you're going to have at least 12 to 15 different things that can really influence not just your performance, but some considerations to add depth to your training as well. My goal is to have a bullet list for you of many of the things that I've highlighted in this essay so that you can download it for free, plus several other things when you log in over at Kung Fu Podcast. So let's get ourselves ready and take a real strong look at many of the factors that can either make us slower or faster at the time when it really counts. I got to know Peter through the World Combat Association, which is a branch of the original British Combat Association that he and his partner Jeff Thompson put together in 1993. Peter writes, "The purpose in working with police forces has been to inject some sense of reality into the existing training programs, teach impact development, preemption, and close-quarter tactics." He also says that passing on martial arts skills is most difficult with police officers, whose time allocation for refreshing unarmed and armed skills is probably less than 1 year than most committed martial artists put into training for 2 weeks. The tendency in police training was, and probably is, to try and teach what Peter says are high-level skills which incline towards fine and complex motor skills. Combinations of techniques, together with the emphasis on combative stances and movement, which one would normally associate with what we might term fighting skills. On a separate issue, the ethos of police training has become more and more inclined to developing a kit-based confidence, but without developing confidence and unarmed skills preparatory to that. Problems arise because many of the situations officers find themselves in rarely allow them to adopt even an appropriate fighting stance, never mind engaging in a complex exchange of blocks and counters, yet this is the basis of how they practice. In reality, when engaging with someone, they would normally be standing in what Peter calls a social stance, possibly slightly side on to the other person, but upright and with their feet rather close together, just like any of us would stand if we were having a conversation with someone. But from this position, getting into a fighting stance simply cannot happen, and it would also give a tell of preparation that an adjustment was being made to move into some sort of combative-looking stance. So right off the bat, we already have several good points to consider. Inject reality into our training. Avoid overemphasizing a high level or complex skill set. And make sure that any skills that you're working for actually apply to your objectives and that you can allocate time so that they can be embodied. And then the last one I noted is that putting yourself in a position that any adjustments that you would make would be a tell of preparation. So let's move back into Peter's article, where we're going to be introducing the concept that I was taught as too much junks in your head. More critically to police training has been the introduction of a range of weapons and the associated kit that includes side-handled batons, telescopic batons, improved straight batons, rigid handcuffs, incapacitant spray, and a range of body armor, all seemingly of a great value to officer safety by providing with the impactive weapons a force multiplier, whereas in practice probably of less value than many would care to admit. And let's try to explain that for a moment. One of the concepts that Peter tries to emphasize in police training is the psychological condition known as risk compensation. This condition is applicable to every human being, and it broadly states that we are all prepared to take on more risk in exchange for perceived gain and safety. Often, it is only a perceived risk, and the formula begins to work against us. Peter participated in a study of one aspect of police training which involved some 20 police officers taking part in scenarios where the aggression and violence increased, culminating in them being taken by surprise at close quarters. In every single case, and where the assailant was at touching range, each and every officer attempted to draw their telescopic baton. About a half a dozen had it taken off of them. About the same amount had it jammed in the holster, and most of the rest couldn't bring it into play at what had become almost instantly grappling range. More critically, when the baton couldn't be used, all confidence in being able to physically handle the assault just went out the window. All of them had been convinced through their training that the baton would be an asset in their personal safety, and it also became, as a consequence, a false sense of confidence. So what were some of the things that we just learned about risk compensation, the downsides of it? You might study the wrong tool for the circumstances. You could have this, what I call a silver bullet myth, that, the telescopic baton in this particular example is what we're going to pull for each and everything. And then the other, which is kind of follows that, is that all confidence was placed in the silver bullet. No confidence was placed and training was placed in other approaches. As Mike Tyson says, everyone's got this plan until they get hit in the mouth. In this case, every officer had a plan until their baton didn't work. Peter continues with his article, and he says that as civilians, we can draw a number of important lessons from such experiences and training deficiencies, and not just related to weapons, but the broad issue of inappropriate techniques for the circumstances that we may encounter. A perfect example of risk compensation out in the world is the seatbelt legislation. Following the compulsory wearing of seatbelts, there was a noticeable drop in the serious nature of injuries sustained in car crashes. But what didn't change was the number of accidents which, over a short period of time, actually rose. This is the risk compensation principle at work. People have believed the propaganda about the safety of seatbelts, which was not untrue, but the exchange they made, having taken on board the increased perceived safety of wearing a seatbelt, was to drive faster and less carefully. There are many other examples of risk compensation, but coming back to the police officers and the weapons, it has had a major impact, and a negative one, on what Peter believes on matters of officer safety, where the perception gained by most officers is that they are now safer and more competent with this range in their kit than they would be without it. And in too many cases, it's just not true. For many of us as martial artists, we have bought into the myth of martial arts as an answer for all situations. If we can stay with the police analogy for just another moment or two, one very clear problem with how police training was delivered was it was focused on what can be called the classic angry man. In other words, an officer would be dealing with someone who was non-compliant and becoming increasingly aroused, possibly even building up to becoming violent. So training focused on conflict management models of communication and a step-ladder-like progression of options that an officer could adopt from a force continuum model to match the potential aggression of the offender. However, when one steps back from that scenario, there are actually some 5 very specific situations in which an officer could face violence and be attacked, but no distinctions have been made in the training delivery in respect of what techniques and tactics would and would not work in each of these separate 5 circumstances. And what about situations that we may find ourselves in as civilians? You know, there's certainly the angry man where things are kind of escalating along the way and you're trying to get it de-escalated, and we're working through the continuum of force. That one, yeah, we could work on that one, and that actually needs to be worked on. But then what about things like disguised attacks? You know, where someone's pretending to be a lost tourist, or, you know, just down on his luck asking for money. How about being ambushed just by one? What about a situation where you're having to face multiple enemies, 2 to 3 at one time? And then we also have to consider the possibility that we're unarmed, but we have to face a weaponized criminal who's got either a blade or a firearm. Well, those are 5 situations that I just listed off the top of my head, and I'm sure could come up with a few more, but those were the first 5 that popped up in my head. And as Peter writes, the angry man scenario and how officers were taught to handle it was predicated on what is termed warning signs and danger signs, these being a range of both verbal and nonverbal signs that an officer could identify, all indicating this increasing state of arousal, so anticipating the point at which the offender might attack. Unfortunately, though, there are people who can explode into violence with no indications of these indicators, and then there are those who are very well aware of the signals they may give off and therefore suppress them, so as to take people by surprise when they attack. Peter continues by saying that working the doors for many years gave him an in-depth experience about how people disguise both arousal and intent. The warning signs are not always there to see. Martial arts training brings with it the same issues. We may not match our scenarios with specific techniques, or even simplistically ensuring that we match techniques to distance, that Peter refers to as the concepts of ranges and tools. As a side note, this concept of matching techniques to distance is one that I taught at the Shirite Bujutsu Kai seminar in Dallas. I call it every technique has a distance, And pretty much what I do is I take the group through several styles of Chinese martial arts and provide a single flow theory in and out, trying to move in and out of ranges, and a couple of flow drills so that the karateka practitioners in that case could get a feel of how I approach it, which is designed to give them food for thought and look at the principle and then make it work for them. But as we move forward, we're getting ready to talk about an extremely important rule that Peter defines as the 1-yard rule. And he starts off by saying, we need to face one very hard truth as martial artists. Blocking doesn't work out in the public environment. He continues by saying, quote, if someone is within touching distance of you, there is only one truism. Action beats reaction. Try touching someone at speed who is within an arm's length distance with no telegraph, and even against a person prepared for it, the blocks will be too late. But when you're engaged in conversation with someone and under stress, and when then taken by surprise, unconsciousness will be the first consequence, not a block and a counter. Move out of touching range, and now the whole situation changes, as the person cannot hit you without moving the whole body, which is much slower and which telegraphs movements to which you can suitably react. The problem you have to come to terms with, though, is that someone who is facing you down, angry and getting angrier, and on the verge of violence, won't do it from 5 feet away. They close in. That's why we have the phrase about somebody being in your face. They will move into your space, something that simply cannot be allowed, and moving back to create space won't work, as they simply fill the gap, as well as you having given them confidence. Moving back also requires you having somewhere to back into. Many years ago, the more specialist units found to their cost the same problem with close-range firearms encounters and when carrying a concealed handgun when they were trying to deal with an armed opponent. If the opponent had the edge in drawing their weapon, it soon became apparent that trying to beat them to the draw would likely end in disaster. It brought about the principle known as the 1-yard rule, which in essence says that if someone is beating you to the draw at such close range, your first port of call, so to speak, should not be to attempt to beat them to the draw by going for your own weapon, but by applying empty hand skills and impacting hard, sometimes known as punch for time. This is a very basic and well-established close-quarter combat training concept, still practiced in specialist military circles, but it had escaped the notice of police training, and traditional training deceives martial artists into believing they have the tools for all occasions, whereas the opposite is true. Very simply, if you let someone close enough to you that they are within touching distance, then you've put yourself in the danger zone. A quick inventory of some of the concepts that Peter just shared with us was 1, applying the 1-yard rule, remembering that when you are within arm's reach, action trumps reaction. I also made a note that assuming you have space all the time is a flaw in training. And then the last one there is you're behind in tempo. You're a quarter beat, a half beat behind, punch to buy time. An empty hand close quarter combat skill. Peter goes on to write, the problem we all have, police and martial artists alike in violent situations, is the problem of having too many techniques and too many options. You may be thinking just the opposite, that the more you know, the safer you will be. But let me assure you that it is simply not the case. This is the classic egg timer syndrome. Picture that old-fashioned egg timer filled with thousands of grains of sand, and as if you had turned it over to start timing, all the grains of sand rushed to get through the narrow neck into the other half, you would have the classic log jam. Peter shares a story that while he was working the Manchesters, as he had for over 10 years, it was within the first few months there that there was an incident that made him realize that he knew too many techniques. He knew too many combinations, and he knew too many potential responses. And at a time in a confrontation when all he needed was one simple and impactful technique when he was faced with a violent man on the verge of attacking. Peter realized that he was moving too late because he was in the hunt for a suitable technique answer to the problem, and he began mistaking some competence and fighting skills with actual defensive tactics. So too many skills for a single job can create a delayed response. Peter writes, quote, "It's happening to police officers with their range of kit options, unarmed techniques, and a fear of any use of force leading to a disciplinary postmortem. Remember that violent encounters in the street aren't dojo scenarios. They are stressful to the point that some people cease to function at all, and physiological changes our bodies go through to deal with such situations often only serve to heighten the stress. One faculty that suffers more than most is decision-making, particularly the decision to preempt when clearly no other option exists. This condition affects people in situations where there may be life and death decisions to be made, yet the person responsible becomes incapable and is referred to as paralysis by analysis," end quote. So we need to also account for the fact that stress is directly going to affect our ability to make a decision. So let's take a moment and verify Peter's statements with an outside resource, preferably a total third party who has no dog in the race and in the field. And that's going to lead me to bringing in Miss Laura King. She has been a law enforcement professional for over 20 years, currently serving as the commander of the McHenry, Illinois Police Department. Ms. King has also earned her Ph.D. in psychology and actively works to bring the fields of law enforcement and psychology together. And get this, she wrote an entire article on her blog titled, "Do Cops Have Too Many Tools on Their Belts?" So let's take a moment and let's see what an actual police officer veteran has to say about having several options on the toolkit. She starts with a question. Is it possible in our quest to make officers safer, we've compromised their ability to make sound decisions during crucial moments? She describes a time when law enforcement was a simpler profession, when an officer went on the street with a sidearm, a baton, a pair of handcuffs, and a radio on their belt. In the squad car, there was a radio to communicate with dispatch and other officers. Now, as I read that, I can fondly remember as a boy watching my granddad putting on his baton, his weapon, his handcuffs, and going out to work and literally walking the streets. Or with like my dad, if you were trying to get in touch with another officer, you had to call them over the air or drive around until you had found the area that you had allocated. Miss King says it was just a simpler time, and even though they lacked all the accessories that they have now, they still got the job done. She writes, quote, "If there was a conflict with an aggressive subject, we had 4 options: verbal commands, hands-on, the baton as a leveraged tool or strike weapon, and deadly force. The use of force continuum was taught because it was clear which tool was acceptable based on the level of resistance. All of that has changed," end quote. Then Ms. King starts to write about some of the implementations, and one of the first accessories she puts in there is the OC spray, or what we know of as pepper spray. And she says that most practitioners were thrilled to have another use of force option, that it provided a control tactic that did not require the officer to go hands-on, and in theory, this would keep the officer safer. But even with that one addition, the clarity of the use of force continuum began to grow more complicated. She said one of the problems was that officers that had already been on the job now had to remember when they should use the OC spray versus the baton. She continues by writing about electronic control weapons and how this added another complication to the force continuum. For example, if you were an officer that went from one agency to another, and if you had already been an officer working in a place that had either the spray or the weapons, and you went to a place that didn't have it, or vice versa, you were creating a whole mess of problems for that officer. And she finishes by asking a question that says, quote, "We now must ask ourselves, which is more important, having more tools or ease of decision making?" End quote. Now that certainly supports Peter's claim to the logjam, and Miss King writes about it further from a psychological perspective, where she writes about science and officer safety. And she says from a data-driven standpoint, the answer is very arguably yes, that there are benefits to the officer's safety being realized with the introduction of these tools. But then, she writes, quote, "Having additional less lethal options as a way to address situations gave officers an effective way to intervene in violent situations that protected their personal safety. It allowed officers to handle the event in a less aggressive way than engaging in hand-to-hand conflict." End quote. But with that said, if the officers were faced with a use of force incident and they were delayed in their response because they were deciding which tool to use, is that moment actually safer for the officer? Let's put a pause there for Laura King's essay. Science tells us that the more options we have, the longer we will take to make a decision. And remember what Peter shared. A delayed decision, the consequence could mean that you get knocked out, injured severely, or killed. Miss King describes it as having too many options puts a person into a subdued version of a panic reaction. We begin to consider all the options and all of the potential outcomes instead of taking action. The more important the decision, for example, using force as compared to where to go to dinner, the difference in that importance creates more intensity. And that intensity gives us a sense of being overwhelmed, and thus we react slower. That would be a perfect reason why Peter described that move from a decision-making process to an action trigger process. Miss King writes that we all experience sequential elimination before we ever make a choice. Sequential elimination is not always done in the conscious mind, but it is always done. And as a reference note, this sequential elimination process is identified and accepted as a course by many others. So for example, marketing campaigns rely on sequential elimination as an effective tactic. The advertisement shows you 5 competitive laundry detergents. They give you this minimum standard, and they'll say, for example, it attacks body odors. You know the type that makes those geese stand up in the closet all by themselves. Or, for example, the laundry detergent eliminates grass stains. That's the new minimum, right? And the next competitor or two is dropped out until only one remains, the one that can eliminate body odors, the grass stains and dirt that you get when you throw each other around outside, plus this one also whitens. See, that is what the martial artist is looking for in a detergent as delivered by sequential elimination. We all go through a process when we are trying to decide on techniques and the forces that we're going to use. Also, just an FYI, sequential elimination is predominant in making career decisions, and politicians use it all the time to influence voting decisions. But Miss King makes it clear. Studies show that if you have a smaller choice set, you will make better decisions. And then she poses the question, what does this mean for law enforcement and our ever-growing toolbox? And so I want to ask you, what does that mean to you as a martial artist? If you practice for health, benefits, or sports exclusively, you may not feel like that really affects you at all. In fact, sports actually helps you eliminate some of the sequential elimination process, doesn't it? It gives you rules. You can do this and you can't do that. And if you get in enough practice and enough repetitions under intensity, you can operate in that sporting paradigm very well because it's consensual and the opponent is abiding by the same rules. That eliminates a lot of stress too because it makes making decisions much, much easier. Then Ms. King goes on in the next paragraphs describing details of law enforcement work that may not directly apply to us as martial artists, but she does bring to light a scientific fact. Quote, studies have been done that prove there is a finite store of mental energy available to each individual for exerting self-control. Even the smallest decisions we make each day deplete this energy and detract from the next decision-making process. Many of us have experienced this in our lives after coming home from work. Think about the last time you had a long day and your spouse or partner asked you to choose a restaurant to go to dinner. Chances are you just couldn't decide. This is decision fatigue in action, end quote. End of Laura King's article. And this is a perfect place to slide back into Peter's article, where he's describing the problems of having all these techniques and that we know too much for it to be of actual use. And when the stress hits us, the first faculty that we lose is the ability to make a decision, which is exactly the same issue that Dr. King pointed to. As Peter writes, the longer we allow an aggressive confrontation to develop, the less ability we have to act, and with too many choices, the problem is magnified. Like police officers with their weapons, martial artists have taken refuge in the belief that the more complex the martial art we practice, the safer we will be. So as we're coming to the close of Peter's article, and we just heard from Ms. King, we're describing these problems of having too many techniques. And Peter says that we have so much of it that we can't actually use it. And then when the stress hits us, the first faculty that we lose is the ability to make a decision. And that's exactly the same thing that Ms. King said. We also have to consider that the more we allow an aggressive confrontation to develop, the less ability we're going to have to decide to act in a timely fashion, and then with too many choices, that problem is even magnified. Peter writes, don't rush in where angels fear to tread in the mistaken belief that your vast array of techniques and skills will be to your advantage. Another note that I made for us to look into in a future podcast is that there is a very separate argument between one's ability to carry out whether it's fine or applicable skills or gross motor skills under stress. And we're going to slate that for a whole different podcast because it grew legs fast when I was thinking about implementing it into this particular podcast. Peter's article closes with, our perceived safety in growing a great deal may lead us to falsely believe that we can take on all comers in any set of circumstances. And the truth is that we will be successful in direct relationship to what we discard, not to what we know. If we apply our knowledge and skills, it will enable us to make allowance for fundamental issues. For example, sequential elimination. When we can work through those fundamental issues, then we will make the successful leap from the relative safety of the dojo to the less predictable and sometimes unsafe reality of the civilian community life. I hope you enjoyed that article by Peter Consterdine, The 1 Yard Rule and the Egg Timer. So let's go through 12 main points. Actually, there's probably more than that with the little subsections and all, but I just laid out 12 and said, okay, here's 12 main points you might want to consider that most likely will affect your ability to respond in a fluid and decisive manner. You don't need to write all these down. If you go to kungfupodcast.com/BeSwift, when you log in, I'll have a PDF file for you there so you can just download the notes that I took and the summations of these main points. First is inject reality into your training. 2 is avoid overemphasizing a skill set that is complex or at such a high level that you may not actually be able to apply it to your objectives, or you don't have time to embody it. Number 3, avoid putting yourself into a postural situation that any adjustments that you may make would be a tale of preparing for an engagement. Number 4, exercising a perimeter, the 1-yard rule, to keep your hands as a measure of how close someone is to you. That in itself is extremely important. I recently had a man who approached me just outside of a grocery store. I saw him coming through the parking lot. He obviously was a little down on his luck. And once he saw that I saw him, he was walking to me. He started to talk to me, and I just paused him as he continued to get closer, and I held out my hand and say, "Hey, sir, whatever you have to say to me, you can say from right there. I can hear you just fine." And by that time, I was at my car door, had my keys out, and I had him stopped by the bumper of my car. The point of that being is that he had no intent of stopping until I held up my hand and made it clear that was as close as he was going to get. So I encourage you, learn to practice that 1-yard rule. You can do it and do it in a good, semi-polite manner to get your point across. Because if they don't respect it, you need to get yourself ready for a whole nother problem. Number 5 on my list, I had adding more weapons/tools/techniques. This will contribute to a delayed response, and then in the moment of truth, that could cause a good person to get seriously injured or killed. Underneath that section of adding more weapons and techniques, I created a subsection. The first was a reminder of the risk compensation principle, where you might feel safer and take on more risk just because you've learned more. And that feeling of safety you have may be a complete mirage when the rubber and road come together. Remember the downsides of risk compensation. You can get tunnel vision and practice that one technique or style for all circumstances. You might fall into the silver bullet myth trap, that you believe that secret technique or that secret weapon is the one that's going to work, and it is the only one that works no matter what else you see or hear, and that other styles or approaches would never work. And then the third downside of risk compensation is that all this confidence and effort has been placed into your silver bullet, and then there's no confidence in other approaches. And as Mike Tyson liked to say, everyone has a plan until they get hit in the mouth. In this podcast, every officer had a plan till their baton didn't work. And then the third problem of adding more weapons and tools is the whole principle of sequential elimination. You are consciously and or subconsciously weighing out the risks of response in everything you do. And the more impactful that decision is, the longer it's going to take for you to make it. And remind yourself when you're setting up your program and your training or your curriculum that studies show that if you have a smaller choice set, you're going to make better decisions. With that being said, that is part of the reason why I developed a practical martial arts class where any person of any style can come in, and it's objective-based, it's role-based, it's environmentally based. I don't try to change or give someone a style to practice. What I try to do is let's take what you already know and see if you can make it work here. Because if you can make it work here and here, that's one less thing you have to learn. The smaller number of choices that you have to make from, the better you're going to be in carrying out your objective. The sixth thing I listed as having a direct effect on your ability to respond quickly is training in one delivery modality. That all the circumstances that you practice are going to transform from one behavioral model. In this particular example, the apparent developing agitation of an angry man. Underneath there, I listed a few things to remind yourself of. The 5 specific situations that officers face violence as compared to us, the civilian martial artists, and I listed the common situations that we may run into as civilians, the angry man actually being one of them, disguised attacks, ambush by one, multiple enemies, weaponized criminals, and as I was doing the podcast, it occurred to me, even the emotionally or mentally unsound, someone who's on drugs or drunk, could be another problem that we might deal with as a civilian. Another important thing that I think would be really important for you to know about is what about the kids? And this is a great time to let you know about Agent of Action, Jamie Clubb, and his new book that he's put out this year, When Parents Aren't Around. A Young Person's Guide to Real Self-Defense. Now, the links for it are going to be over in your show notes and on the website, and you'll be able to find his book at Kung Fu Podcast underneath the brand new section of suggested reading that I'm putting together. His is the first book I put in there as a suggested piece of any martial arts reading, and I would suggest you share it with your kids or kids that you might know. In it, Jamie has 3 chapters that speak to teaching kids about the common situations and attackers. Those 3 chapters are titled Life's Warning Signs, Spotting the Warning Signs in Others, and Different Types of Attackers. It's a good book from a good martial artist and a good man. Number 7, uncertainty of your objective. If you practice knowing what you're trying to achieve, what's your role, what are you trying to get done, things will go much faster. Number 8, increasing stress influences our ability to respond. A, too many options puts a person into a subdued version of panic reaction. B, the longer that stress goes on, the more cognitive energy is depleted. And then 3, increased length of stress is inversely related to your ability to make a decision. Number 9, tactical responses to timing. For example, substitute action triggers for decision making. We probably need to talk about that a little bit further, and we'll have to. Preemptive actions, when you know that there's not going to be any other choice. Punch to buy time when you're half beat behind. And I would also encourage you to develop some guiding concepts that encourage good timing. So, for example, sayings like the closest weapon strikes the closest target principle. Or, for example, in the Tibetan Lama Hapgar systems, it uses a mental concept that we have to practice all the time, which is never waste a hand. And basically what that means is you're supposed to attack the young target first so that you get used to attacking the closest thing to you first with the closest hand, foot, whatever you got, and then use a hand-elbow series before withdrawing it. The 10th factor I listed is try to make sure you start with simple mechanical techniques. Number 11, make sure your practice includes intensity training followed by either decision-making, accuracy, or meeting objective training. And then the 12th factor is that ensure that you dedicate the time to train so that you can embody the things that you're trying to practice and meet your objectives. Peter mentioned that a reasonably serious martial artist may spend more time in 2 weeks than an officer is allocated for a year. So that basically tells you, if you're an officer or prison guard, you're going to have some sort of training outside of what is allotted to you outside of work to make any real progress. Exploring the culture, the adventure, and the impact of martial arts. Thank you so much for joining me as we reviewed Peter Consterdine's article titled The 1 Yard Rule in the Egg Timer. It was a fantastic piece of work. We brought in an essay by Dr. Laura King, who is a professional police officer of over 20 years. I tried to put those things together in a way that it would flow, get the stories and some of the main points across. And don't forget that if you go to kungfupodcast.com/BeSwift, you can download the PDF file with the summation of those main points. I've also put on that page, when you log in, you'll see a download for an ebook that I referenced during this podcast. Put them down and take them out, the knife fighting techniques from Folsom Prison. Plus, there's the original post by Dr. Laura King, Do Cops Have Too Many Tools on Their Belt? And as a reminder, check out the suggested studies section where you'll find Jamie Clubb's book, When Parents Aren't Around, A Young Person's Guide to Real Self-Protection. I also want to make a couple announcements here at the end. One is that Samantha May is coming back onto the program here soon. And if you're not familiar with her, go to the podcast that's all about the lost language of Okinawa. I've been invited to go up and spend some time with a fantastic man, Hanshi Doug Perry. I'm really looking forward to sitting down, taking the microphone. He's agreed to give us some recordings. The man was training in Okinawa back in the 50s and 60s during a time where many of us look back to find how was martial arts changing, and he was there. And in closing, I want to say thank you to Mr. Peter Constantine, who was kind enough to share his articles with us and allow us to take them and make ourselves better martial artists. If you like this program and find value in it, support the program by going to kungfupodcast.com/support. I have a number of things that you can do to help support this program. Some of them do not even cost you a penny. I look forward to hearing from you. Take care, have a great practice, and I'll be talking with you soon.